Thank you for joining us for another episode of Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence. We're a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to helping you streamline your RFP process through better education, smarter strategies, and more transparency. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive training, discounts to our virtual and in-person events, and the chance to connect with other procurement professionals throughout the year. And if you're planning a professional event or conference, don't forget our CPE Speakers Bureau is available to speak at regional and national gatherings. Now let's get into today's session of Ask the RFP Doctor, where one of our expert RFP doctors will show you how to take on real-world challenges in procurement and supply chain management and break them down into practical strategies you can use right away.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
Okay, so for today's topic, many owners assume that vendors make profits simply by inflating their bids, but the real story is much more nuanced. The session explores how top-performing vendors maximize overhead, streamline processes, and even return savings to clients, all while navigating the pitfalls of the micromanaging owners. Okay, so procurement's role in profit. So, obviously you don't have direct control of it, but how things are procured will influence how the vendors allocate their profit and look to make profit on the project where they can actually do that. And it wouldn't be necessarily a one-off. They're making their profit allocation decisions based upon trends in client procurement types and what they know about working with your organization. So that initial piece where procurement has the most influence around actually structuring the competitive environment, the one they have to break down their profit within if they're going to provide a price as part of that competition. Obviously, that's where procurement has the most influence. We'll talk about that. In some organizations, procurement also has an influence or some level of say in the contract and the payment structure. So this is also very important. We're not going to spend as much time on that today. But because there's differing roles, but that's also a place that it will impact how they make money. The pricing criteria, so what's actually looked at for price, cost, financial returns, anything to do with money, is one decision. The weighting on that is another, and how it's competed and evaluated, if evaluated, and how it's relatively scored, like, how much more worth it is a certain dollar amount over another in terms of how you allocate the points within that. All of those things impact who wins, and then as a response, it will impact how the vendors price things out. And there's different ways within different procurement structures to take advantage of the weights of how things are being allocated for the payment structure, the rates in terms of what information is being collected. There's lots of detailed skill sets around unbalancing, how vendors can unbalance their pricing model to take advantage later on in the project to get more, so they can lower their bid price or their proposal price, but then actually maximize their return. So they can do both at the same time. And we'll talk a little bit about that. That's a little bit more complex, but it's something that I've learned from vendors how they do it internally, and they have entire algorithms to help optimize this for certain procurement types. Another phenomena that we've seen is that we may say performance is more important than price. We've seen organizations where they will have price as low as 10 or 15% of the total final evaluation score. But when you look at what actually decides who wins, because the other criteria are not easily evaluated, that the evaluations are so close or the scoring is so close, really all the difference comes down to price. And so if you have a 10% or 15% weight and 95 or 90% of the projects are still going to the lowest price, then you're still doing a completely price-based pursuit, even though your weights may not look like you are. So weights alone don't actually indicate how you're focused. It's really more about what's being evaluated, how it's being evaluated, and those vendors' opportunities to differentiate themselves within those criteria outside of price. So proper procurement practices can enforce good behaviors both in the vendors and internally to your clients and yourselves, but it also can incentivize bad behaviors to vendors and to yourselves. So you can go both ways. So the one thing that we've seen is that across time, the only sustainable procurement and contracting model is a win-win, where the client group and procurement can receive high value from their vendor community for the services and projects provided, and this, the products and the services provided, and prove it. Sometimes there's a disconnect between what's bought and what's received. So the win is like we're getting what we bought and we can prove it that you're receiving value. That's the win on the procurement client side. The win on the vendor side is they have a realistic and fair opportunity to make profit, and it's consistent. So they're making a predictable level of profit on your projects. If they have predictable profit, they can lower their margins in their pricing models. Okay. So win-win is, now you can have one-offs where the client makes out like a bandit and the vendor bleeds to death, but that will only happen in a one-off. It won't happen over and over again. Eventually you end up paying more for it. Vendor profit's not evil. We've been in lots of projects where, we start talking about fees and rates and margins, and it's almost like awkward. That's something that is not beneficial to the outcome of the procurement or the project service. It should not be a point of awkwardness, and it's not a bad thing that the vendors are making money. And so, like, as an example of this is we'll hear people in negotiations or in a change order situation or a mod or a scope expansion, or a financial discussion, and the client group or the procurement folks will say, now we know you all need to make money on this job, and they'll say it in a way of like, yeah, we know you need to make money, and then it's into something else. So that's actually not a good mentality or behavior. We actually recommend that when you're having those discussions, it's this phrase here is what I'd recommend. It's important to us that you are meeting your financial goals on this project. This is from you to the vendor. And if that's not the case, let's discuss it. We are not benefited by your loss. And that moves it to a more collaborative structure around the health of your vendors financially is in your best interest, because you will get better and more consistent pricing and become a preferred client. Another challenge we've seen in procurement organizations is that again, this is a hard one. So I understand these things. I think I do. If you squeeze the vendors, if you get more out of them or get them to lower their price, that it's a good thing. And that's part of your job. We would recommend the job mentality is create the most value long-term, either on a specific service or on a project portfolio. The squeezing is good, mentality. It can work at a micro level, but it's not going to work across time. Because, as an example, we've done one of the things we do for certain partners we have is we go in and we will assess their procurement and organization. And part of that assessment is a third-party review from their vendors. Okay, so like we'll ask the vendors, and one of the things we look at is like, how good of a customer are they compared to other customers in the same industry or same type of work categories? And how does that impact your pricing? And you will hear things like, well, as soon as we step 1 foot onto their land, our prices go up 16%. So they know you're going to squeeze them. They know you're hard to work with. They're going to be familiar with your negotiation tactics, and that will be priced in. right? And so it actually doesn't save you money in the long run. Very difficult to prove this financially. And it does feel right to most of the traditional business model. But that's not what the evidence that we have in the data that we have shows. So best and final offer can drive up initial pricing. So can, one thing we see companies with the AI contract negotiators, and if you've seen a few of those demos and things that are out there already, that's also probably going to drive up negotiation. I think people will figure it out pretty quick. The AI, have to deal with an AI. So BAFO, it typically will drive up initial pricing. And then BCBs is bad client behaviors or bad customer behaviors will drive up the total risk. And so they will adjust their markup, and profit is the cushion. So the majority of vendors in industry aren't pricing out contingency separately. Their markup includes, so they'll have their base cost. So internally, a vendor's going to price out a job. They're going to price it out what they actually will think it will take them to do it. They then will look at the market and how much work they're needing, how hungry they are for more work, what they see the value of you as a long-term client or to add to their portfolio, or if you're a current customer, to maintain that relationship, what's needed. And they'll balance those things and they'll tack on a markup. The markup will include some level of projection of how much of their general corporate expenses, just their general corporate overhead, they will allocate to the contract as a percentage. And that's a guess, because if you think about, a company will know how much they're going to spend a year just to run the company, not to do any work, but just to like exist as a company, buildings, equipment, real estate, insurance, general staff, executives, etc., marketing people. Those types of costs, they will know what they're going to spend for the next year, or even up to 2-3 years, some cases with normal inflation and raises and whatnot. But they don't know how much work they're going to win for the next year. And so they don't know exactly what percent, as you go across time, they don't know exactly how much work's coming. So they don't know exactly what percent to allocate to a project. So that markup will include their best guess of the percentage of their annual overhead they're going to assign to your contract as part of that payment. And then it'll include their profit. Now, some like 16, it depends what data source you're looking at, but somewhere around 10 to 20% of organizations will have a separate line item in their internal pricing models in their markup category for contingency, which is just they're pricing in risk in a separate line item than in their actual direct or financial model for the work itself. But most organizations, the vast majority, profit also includes contingency. So that is their cushion, is their profit. So then the other aspect of that is when you get into the negotiation stage, when the negotiations became a profit defense or a markup defense for those vendors, it will create problems, higher probability it will create challenges later on that you won't see in procurement. It won't be your problem at that point. But later on in the project, when it goes late, you need modifications, the scope changes, it expands, you want to add some more things, it will cost you more later. So a proper selection process will minimize the need for financial negotiations. And, from our standpoint, what we've seen both, research-wise and then hands-on, moving from a financial negotiation mentality from that standpoint to a financial clarification is a best practice. So that's kind of the setup there. Big picture, depending how you procure. So in most procurements, price is overly important. Now, not all of them, but in our research set and the data we've collected in a few thousand RFPs, typically price is overly emphasized to the detriment of the overall project. So in this example, you may have seen this before, performance is on the left, low to high. So vendor one, high performing. If you hire them, lower probability of problems, lower risk if you bring them on board. Vendor four, newer, younger, less experienced, lower performing, higher chance of problems if you hire them, less knowledge, less capable overall. Now, in most procurement models, when it comes to what they're actually pricing things to, they're pricing it to the scope and the requirements. Because of the legal precedence that's been set over and over and over again in almost all procurements, even in ones that are more, nuanced and flexible in terms of their pricing and with the scope, the pricing will be to the minimums of the scope or the requirements or the specification or the, whatever the contract actual terms are. And so there's lots of things, risk, issues, uncertainty, cost that the vendor has to price. And all of those uncertainties and risks that they have to price and include and put some level of uncertainty in each line item or each bucket or each staffing model could be more accurate, but because of the way they have to win the job, the only risk they have to minimize first is the risk of not winning the job. And so all the other risk, all the other concerns, all the other pricing is irrelevant if you don't minimize the first risk, which is the risk of not winning the job. And so in most procurements that we've studied and we participated, or that we've watched, pricing will be overemphasized, or it's the only criteria besides some minimum pass fails. And that will actually drive the vendors to do as little as possible and interpret the requirements and the statement of work as a minimum. And so that it's not an intent. It truly is, if it's not included, it's not included. And that will cause, pricing issues later on downstream and profit issues. So that will compress the competition, and you will actually lose potential value that was contained in the higher performing vendors. It's actually squeezed out of just the way it's being bought, because their profit model, when they're chasing work that is overly price focused for selection, the business model becomes volume based for the vendors. They make the most money year to year by step one, winning as much work as possible. Step two, then figure out how to do it. And that procurement model has actually forced the proposal and pursuit and business development structures that currently exist in vendors. So you look how a vendor is structured. They've got people whose job it is to chase work, to get work, to propose on work, to price work. And it's a totally separate group to actually do the work. Well, that bifurcation exists only because that's how procurement has set up the game to win the work. And what happens then is the client has given their scope or their statement of work or their spec requirements, however you want to say it, and they've expressed that in what becomes a legal minimum, but they actually want something higher, and they're trying to manage to that. That's the squeeze. Conversely, the vendors have priced it that minimum is actually a maximum. And if they perform at a higher level than that requirement, the cost of that performance directly comes out of their profit. And that's the conundrum that procurement has created, and the legal system has reinforced, and it just made precedents. So you're not going to change that structurally in the industries, but you can navigate around it with better procurement practices. And then what will happen is so during procurement, we'll do our best to make sure these lines, that the understanding of the buyer side and the client side of what the requirement is, or the expectation, and then the vendor's understanding of that same expectation, we'll do our best to make sure we think we both understand it the same, that we as the buyer and they as the vendor understand and read and comprehend those intents the same. But what will happen in most projects and services, you'll notice that at various points, the client thought they bought this level of performance or service, and the vendor thought they sold this level of performance or service. And then project management becomes managing the gap of expectations. And that's a totally different conversation, but you'll watch that phenomena happen. And the primary mechanism that people default to manage that gap is relationships and friendships. They try to work it out, which is not a good business model. It works, but it's not the optimal. And so, but that's another phenomenon, and that's all driven by just how we're procuring. It sets all that up downstream. So in this traditional environment, and what happens most times, vendors have to price it lower for their proposal or as low as possible, because winning is the first risk to minimize. And then doing the work and making profit on that work is a second issue. And those are actually different groups and departments inside of vendor organizations. And we've done this, we've had a lot of fun, well, fun for us, but in helping vendor side, like get through some of these issues, in the vast majority of organizations, the operations, technical people don't like the business development, sales, VP executives, and estimating people, the pricing people. There's real contention. And they will say things like, well, we had to do that to win the work. And operations like, how am I actually supposed to do it that fast and that cheap? And you have this contention, and that's not good for anyone. It impacts profit. It incentivizes bad behaviors in the proposal process. So that's a big problem. The other issue, especially nowadays, this is one thing we're seeing, and we don't have data. This is more anecdotal. This is hard to collect data. Since there's so much variability in the marketplace, supply chain, pricing, workforce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, technology changes, robotics, those who have more knowledge and more understanding of what's happening with prices and where things are going, they may have a more accurate cost analysis or a cost proposal because they understood the risk better. But those who have less knowledge or less expertise will then become more competitive because they have less knowledge. They don't price it accurately, but now they're more competitive. They're going to have a better chance of winning the job. And then you're stuck with someone who underpriced it, didn't see the escalation coming, didn't see the supply chain issues, and now you're trying to manage those risks with them. And you never outsourced anything. And now you have no competition on that extra pricing. So you lose all competitive pricing after you sign that contract. Everything else is negotiated. And the vendors know this. They know they only have to be the cheapest for one day. After that, everything is up for grabs. And so, this all creates, challenges downstream. And because they're just they won't make their profit on their bid or their proposal price. They'll make their profit on the changes. So also like nowadays, when there's limited suppliers or higher demand, this model also lets this price-based model allows the vendors take advantage easier because they can tell you what you want to hear. They're like, oh, wow, how can they do this cheap? But then once you've got them, once they're in, you're going to have to deal with them no matter what. It's too hard to go backwards. So we've just wrapping up a study right now where this is like a major issue with a lot of customers and folks buying things. Incentivizes the focus on relationships. I talked about that, but not just in the project, but also to win the work. And so get the client to like you, all the business development, all those things become a lot more important in this environment. And then all of that work you do up front to get a little bit of, potentially unintentional bias in the evaluators when they choose will then also make it easier to make money once you're in. They're going to support you. They'll approve your changes, your billings more easily, et cetera, et cetera. And so it will incentivize the value of relationships, and that will become very important. And the vendors will spend millions of dollars just having people to be your friends. So when work comes out, you already love them. Higher average profit margin. If you use, what would you like us to do? The other thing this does, In this environment, since you're driving towards minimums, the vendors are incentivized to just ask the clients, here's an issue, what would you like us to do? And then once the client opens their mouth and starts talking, they then transferred all the risk back to your organization and the cost of executing whatever they said. And so this actually helps people with less expertise. And the vendors can become disincentivized to use innovative approaches because it's too risky to do that and still win the work. So another challenge, and you'll see this in some of the more price-based in industries are like, you'll hear things like, why is so many different sectors of construction so technologically like deficient? Well, because it's profitable, right? You're better off because you had to come in cheap to win the work. If you come in cheap, you're better off just doing what you're told because they'll always pay you if you do what they tell you. Minimum requirements mindset. We talked about this. The flip side of this is for some vendors, not all of them can do this, but for some vendors, if they will look at your requirements, they will know what you missed. They will price what is explicit very as cheap as possible, and they will actually have planned out as part of their proposal preparation and part of their pricing, they'll have a separate line items and separate plans of what you missed and when they're going to tell you. So we've seen vendor operations where they say, yep, month 5, we're going to bring up this thing they missed. And we think that's the best chance to maximize our profit, but not interrupt our workflow too much. And so that's extremely sophisticated in some organizations. And so this also pushes that as making the profit on the back end. And again, you have no competition on that repricing or that extra work or that missed work. The type of contracts they're used, especially nowadays, almost always are delayed. So you're in these models, in the traditional model, most things aren't finishing on time, or they're adding an extra year because it's running late, or the procurement took longer, or the contract took longer. So the vendors all know this. They'll act surprised, but everyone knows it's going to go longer than what we say at the start. That lets them stack overheads. They can stack extra bodies, and it will incentivize that type of bad profit behavior. Specifically when pricing rates like dollars per hour or dollars per unit, you will force the vendors to price. You're like, hey, give us the hourly rates for these 6 people, right? And these type of IT positions or whatever it is. They will price those in a way that will reflect their stacking. And then they will try to get as many people as possible and they'll push for more. And it's really hard to fight that because you're like, how do you know they only need 2 workers when they say they need 3? You don't have any proof of that. And so it becomes, again, you're at the mercy of, negotiations and what they say and or they'll staff it low, we should add 2 more people. Boom, they just went to 4. What they started with 3 in the first place, you never would have felt you were falling behind. So they can actually understaff at the start, make the feeling of delay, and then overstaff once they get your approval to add 2 more people, 3 more people. You'll see lots of people show up on every phone call, over allocation of hours. They'll want more of your time, extra reviews. Let's do 2 reviews. Oh, let's do another meeting on this. These are all behaviors driven by that pricing model up front and how they're trying to drive their profit. Okay, in a better environment, vendors are attracted by the opportunities or expertise for faster work. So this is the key. So in the highest performing vendors we've measured, the way they make money is by doing more work faster. They don't want to just do volume based. They want to do as much high quality work they can do faster with minimum interruption and actually use what they're good at to benefit their customers. So not every vendor is this way. And most vendors will have a portion of their company that's this way. It won't be the whole company. So in most industries, if you look at a vendor's financial structure, the way they actually optimize their bottom line after-tax profit, the real money they make each year. Number one, speed. The faster they can go, the more money they're going to make. And again, not all industries, but most industries, this is true. If you let them plan it in detail and minimize their interruptions, and that goes back to speed. If you let them direct the work and provide that guidance and let them use that expertise, they can maximize their profit. Coordinate with the client, make yourself available, get them what they need to facilitate their execution of the work, maximize their profit. So the best vendors that actually make higher margins are looking for a client that is not overly direct and control them. Now, not every vendor team can do this. So that procurement model needs to be situated to attract that type of team and then marry that up to the client's ability to work with those good teams. And those two things to optimize pricing go together. They optimize your pricing and will optimize the vendor's profit. So selection's first. Second step is clarification. Those two things are both part of procurement. I'm sure you've talked about that in past things. Price is a critical factor, but more for validation and less for direct comparison. This is a little bit of a shift in thinking. I understand that. Now, you'll always have price protection. So one of the things we recommend is a pretty simple competitive range, but it's adjusted based upon project, attributes. I've got a little thing here on that. Price can be considered both quantitatively, like comparing numbers, and qualitatively. Now, in some of our assessments and audits, we've actually found a lot of the financial analysis, I think it's due to a lack of familiarity with some procurement people, just like how Excel works and some basic mathematical normalizing techniques. There can be quite a few mistakes made in the financial analysis. So that's an area of consideration to make sure that's actually being done correctly on the quantitative side. How that's done, if you normalize it, if you have some type of scale, et cetera. And then qualitatively, especially in today's environment where things are less certain, you can have a separate qualitative where there's actually a financial discussion as part of that procurement process. And we're doing that on several projects right now where, pricing may be, 15% or 10% or 20%, and half is on the actual numbers that we may collect in 3 or 4 different ways, and half is on a discussion that's actually rated by a separate subcommittee of walking us through their financial model. That's not necessarily appropriate for all projects, but it can be done. For most industry services, cash flow is king. So it's not so much about the projected dollar amount they may make as a percentage. It's about how quick they can get that money, especially in today's, the way things are financially. So this will change the perspective on profit. So there will be a line item in a vendor's internal pricing model that is a profit, or they'll have a fee. Sometimes they'll say fee, but there's also a separate one that's like their profit, what they expect to make on the job. And that's the internal goal for the job. And that's how they're measuring their internal personnel at the end of the year. And I've been in many of these on the vendor side where a project went south, and the main thing they're looking at is how do we miss our profit margin so bad? They're not so much worried about why were we wrong about this pricing or the number of people. They have processes for that. It's more of what was our fundamental mistake that we were so wrong about the outcome. So the opportunities to optimize the profit and that potential is very attractive. Potentially more attractive than potential is certainty. So for example, we've got a little bit of this, but I had an interesting conversation a few months, maybe about a year and a half ago. I was talking to some business owners, and we were doing some procurement contracting type stuff. And now they were the vendors, but we were inside the client's, offices. It was a whole bunch of us. And we were walking through what's the most attractive profit structure, like if we're going to structure these procurements and these contracts. And it was interesting. So the even more attractive than like a potential better profit was, and like one of them said, I've been doing work with your company. So I've been a vendor to your company for over 20 years. Before I came to this meeting, because I knew we were going to talk about, I looked at our average end of the day profit margin on our projects we've done for you for like the last, we had data for like the last seven-ish years. Wasn't what the whole, they didn't have all 20 years of data still, but there's like 7 or 8 years of data. He's like, our profit margin has ranged from negative 22% to positive 16%, with an average of like 8. I would love to just know I was getting 6 or 7 or 8 and not even have to worry about getting 16% or losing 20%. That's more valuable to me than any other like innovation. It's just having certainty in my profit. I will be a better vendor and can be more consistent if I have that certainty, because sometimes you're really hard to work with and sometimes we win, and it shouldn't be either way. It should be consistent. So that consistency and certainty, especially for you have vendors over and over again, is valuable. So what's the data actually say? When a procurement is correctly focused on value and profit is part of the, like you're not seeing their profit usually as they're in their bids or their pricing. So 59% of the time, the best vendor you want to hire the most for their performance score is also the lowest proposal price. I know that doesn't make sense. We think higher performance costs more and they're ripping us off, or they're overpricing for that performance. We don't have data that proves that. 83% of the time, the highest rated vendor you want to work with the most after you've gotten their proposals and you've interviewed their people is the lowest or second lowest price. So that means that 17% of the time, you will either being paid a little bit more, and you know you'll be paying more, and you'll have to either justify it's worth it or not, or you will know you'll be working with a less capable team, but it's still a better value because you're looking at value, and value is price and performance. Now, this data is hard to get, so we've done a few studies. We only have a few hundred data points for this. First place vendors, so the ones that win, there's the selected vendors on jobs where the procurement was using a lot of the RFP Doctor best practices. Their average pre-tax profit went from 2 to 5% to 5 to 9%. And prices were lower. So a higher price does not mean higher profit, and a lower price does not mean lower profit. So profit certainty is more important than profit, or more attractive than profit margin. So a couple examples. I know we're kind of long here, Brian, you can cut me off. Just a few examples. This was relatively recently, statewide procurement for an enterprise level software. We did some forensics for this state, and the procurement was, the way it was structured in the criteria, one of the findings was that it allowed a lot of bias and prior relationships to influence the outcome. And it was discovered that a senior person from the state that helped put together before the RFP was released and kind of knew the things the best left and worked for this vendor prior to the RFP release. And that got mixed in there. And then the project was a mess, made the newspapers, ended in an audit, reported that our stuff was used in the legislative review. People were hurt feelings, way more expensive, way delayed, all these issues. And there was so much relationship, negative outcomes of positive, quote unquote, positive relationships that allowed bad behaviors. And a lot of these big consulting firms, a lot of these big vendors, their internal financial incentives to their employees are completely opposite to what's in the best interest of the client. And it is a real challenge. So procurement, procurement wasn't the only problem, but it allowed all the other problems to occur more easily. And so instead of being a safety gate, they weren't. They dropped the drawbridge. This one was a great project. So this was a conversion of, there's several things happening, but the main thing that was being procured was the installation of some solar panels and some EV charging stations in a like a big garage lot type structure for parking for vehicles. And so we've been working with this group for several years. Brian actually ran this one. This was the newest and the youngest project manager on staff. It was their first project for their, working as a client organization. They used our processes, some of our other best practices, and the CP stuff. And they had, a standard set of bids and plans. They did a best value selection with our structure, lump sum contract, some of our after stuff as well. And the vendor did so well, they finished early and they felt guilty because they made so much money. It was on a lump sum contract. So they wrote a deductive change order and gave money back to the client. So we're debriefing this inside the PMO, project management office, with all the other PMs, and they didn't believe it happened. And they started accusing this kid, he was in his 20s, this kid of lying, all these other senior PMs. And then the boss had to come in and be like, this actually happened. They gave us money back, and they still didn't believe it. It was crazy. So like, this is one of like doing it the right way. The vendor's profit price, it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't have to make a difference. You can do things the right way. This was a complex statewide tax system. Failed once before, reran it. We got involved for the rerun. 4 years later, improved the scope, best practices, RFP Doctor best practices. As part of that, and the way it was structured, the vendors were allowed to be more innovative as part of that procurement process, better client behaviors, and they ended up coming in with innovations that chopped off about 30% of the total cost. Client didn't believe it at first. We had a very detailed clarification period. Project went amazing. In the debrief and the closeout, the vendor did great on their profit, even though they dropped the price so much. Last one here, this is one of our favorite, satellite launch facility. Client overspecified the project. All the bids were bid. The pricing was as required, which is our recommendation. And then they were given an opportunity to provide alternatives, similar in the statewide tax system. One vendor had an innovative approach. Client wasn't sure it would work. They went through all their normal clarification, documentation details, and it saved 20% from the base bid. Vendor made good money. We believe we didn't close that one out as well. And they finished early with 0 change orders. So it can go either way. Doing things the right way in procurement just gives you a better chance later on for the project. Now, with all that said, like, just working with the wrong person will eliminate good outcomes for everyone. So the wrong client takes away profit. The wrong vendor takes away value. So be careful who you work with. So that's why we always say focus on the people. So in this picture, you don't know which one's the procurement, which one's the vendor. Okay, so compete, price correctly. Main outtakes here are a summary. Don't overweight or don't overemphasize the pricing. Opportunity to use their expertise in selection and to deliver. Profit only increases long-term as efficiency increases. So that win-win and win-win long-term. We do not have any evidence, nor have we found it in the other body of research, that having expertise makes you more expensive in a properly run procurement or in total cost. So our general rule of thumb is that price should not exceed 35% for any procurement. Now there are some true commodities, but even then it shouldn't be 100% price. And it can be as low as 0 or 5% if there's easy differential, or it's critical of a project outcome, but is a low percentage of the cost, like in design. So why? Why is this okay? Because if you have a good competitive range structure and rules in the RFP or in the solicitation, you will never pay more you'll never overpay. So like the way, and most people have this, but the way we typically recommend it is vendor one, if they're the lowest price and the highest performance, automatically move forward into clarification. You'll automatically select them. If vendor one is not the lowest price, are they within the competitive range of number two? Okay. Some people do the average, some people do it. We just do straight number two because that's who you're going to hire next. That's the next closest you'd want to hire. Now, that range depends upon the dollar size of the contract. So the bigger the contract, the smaller the range. Most common percentages that we have seen is 5, 7, 8, 10, and 15% ranges. We've seen some that are up to 200% on smaller contracts because they're risky. It just depends upon the size and the risk. And the overall people are key, as we always say, and the majority of the weight should be on the team. And that's it. So.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.